All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive into what is arguably one of the most game-changing lenses in all of academia. We're talking about postcolonial theory, and specifically how it completely revolutionized the way we understand culture, art, and knowledge across the humanities. Seriously, whether you're studying English literature, linguistics, fine arts, music, or philosophy, this theory fundamentally shifts how you're going to interpret the world.
So think about this for a second. What actually happens when your history is written by the very people who conquered you? It's a heavy question, right? But it's so important because it forces us to realize that colonialism wasn't just about drawing new borders or physical violence. Actually, scratch that. It was way more insidious. It was a profound psychological and cultural weaponization. European powers justified their brutal exploitation by packaging it as a civilizing mission. They basically pushed this narrative that they were the ultimate center of logic and reason, while the colonized people were just in desperate need of salvation.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to take a structured tour. We'll start with the history and colonial realities, move into defining postcolonial theory, and go over the core concepts and vocabulary. Then, we get to the really fun part, applying this directly to literature and language, fine arts and music, and finally, theater and philosophy.
Okay, part 1, history and colonial realities. Let's establish the actual historical groundwork that made this theoretical framework so necessary.
If we look at the timeline, the 19th century was really the absolute peak of European colonial expansion for empires like Britain, France, and Portugal. But fast forward to the mid-20th century, and things look very different. The devastating economic cost of World War II catalyzed this massive shift in global power over to the United States. And because Europe's resources were completely drained, the door opened for massive decolonization. Just look at the year 1960 alone. 17 different African nations gained their independence in that one single year. And with that newfound freedom came a desperate need to unpack and interrogate the cultural baggage the colonizers left behind.
Frantz Fanon hits the nail on the head in his seminal 1961 work, The Wretched of the Earth. He brilliantly illustrates the dark mechanics of this legacy. Fanon argued that colonial domination wasn't just about stealing resources. It relied on the steady, calculated dehumanization of the colonized. We're talking about severe psychological violence designed to make an entire people feel utterly worthless. And worse still, this erasure of indigenous culture was actively pumped through the colonial education system and the arts, all to prop up this hegemonic myth of European superiority.
Which brings us to part 2, defining post-colonial theory. With these newly independent states finally holding the pen, a powerful new theoretical lens was born. This quote by Helen Gilbert captures it perfectly. Postcolonial theory was established as a direct counter-narrative. It was the colonized standing up and saying, hey, we aren't the historyless barbarians you painted us to be. Instead, as Gilbert points out, they used their cultural productions, their plays, novels, poetry, and films as active expressions of resistance. It was a way to completely destabilize the arrogant assumption that Europe and America were the center of the universe.
All right, part 3, core concepts and vocabulary. Before we can apply this to specific disciplines, we need to grab our toolkit. There are 3 essential concepts you absolutely need to know.
First up is binary opposition. You can think of this as a psychological tool used to rig the game and establish a false hierarchy. The colonizers positioned themselves as the self, superior, logical, and civilized. But to maintain that image, they literally had to invent an other. So they forced these direct contrasts onto the colonized, branding them as inferior, barbaric, and irrational. This whole Occident versus Orient or center versus periphery split, it was entirely manufactured just to justify oppression.
Concept number 2 is hybridity. This is a super fascinating idea brought forward by the scholar Homi Bhabha. He essentially argues that once contact with a colonizer happens, claiming pure, untouched cultural identity is basically impossible. Instead, former colonies exist in what he calls a third space. In this space, identities are forged from a really complex mix of deeply rooted indigenous traditions and the inevitable mimicry of the colonizer's culture. Bhabha says that by fully owning this blended hybrid identity, you actually dismantle European power structures because you're breaking down those strict binary opposites we just talked about.
And our third concept is subalternity, popularized by Gayatri Spivak. This one asks a very blunt question. Who actually gets the microphone? The subaltern refers to the deeply marginalized voices that are completely shut out of dominant power structures. Imagine your entire life being defined by rules and powers you have absolutely zero say in. Spivak highlights a really uncomfortable truth. Even in modern academic circles that try to be progressive, the West often still acts as the dominant subject talking about the marginalized, rather than letting the marginalized speak for themselves.
Moving into Part 4, Application in Literature and Language. Now that we have our vocabulary, let's see how this completely disrupted the literary world.
Just think about how powerful this is. Writers from former colonies purposefully picked up their pens to correct massive historical lies. The legendary author Chinua Achebe, for instance, explicitly stated that he wrote his famous novel Things Fall Apart to prove that African history wasn't just, in his words, one long night of epic savagery waiting for European salvation. He wrote to unequivocally establish that Africa had a deep history, incredibly rich culture, and complex languages long before any colonizer ever set foot there.
This whole movement in literary studies is perfectly summarized by the title of the groundbreaking text, The Empire Writes Back. Postcolonial literature is in a constant, active debate with the West. It's literally writing back to correct stereotypes. Achebe famously took a sledgehammer to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, pointing out the deep-seated racism in what was considered a great European classic. Scholars also use literature to showcase pre-colonial ingenuity, reminding everyone that things like China's printing press or the Nok people's incredible terracotta art existed way before European influence. Even linguistic studies shifted, looking at how African and Caribbean writers blend colonial languages like English or French with indigenous rhythms as a brilliant form of hybrid adaptation.
Next up, Part 5, Application in Fine Arts and Music. Let's pivot from the written word over to the visual and auditory realms.
You really can't talk about art history without talking about Edward Said. He completely flipped the discipline on its head with his concept of Orientalism. Said exposed that when Western art heavily romanticized the East, like parts of Asia and North Africa, it wasn't because they genuinely appreciated the culture. No, it was a calculated method of domination. The East was viewed strictly through a colonial lens, making it look like a beautiful, exotic spectacle, which conveniently kept the West positioned as the serious, rational center of the world. You can see this happening across so many different disciplines. Take fine arts. European painters would literally distort Eastern realities to feed stereotypes back home. French painter Jean-Léon Gérôme's The Slave Market is a prime example. He painted highly sexualized imagery of Oriental women, completely fabricating a reality that starkly contradicted conservative Muslim societies. And in music, it's a similar story. Scholars like Kofi Agawu had to fight what he called epistemological violence. For decades, Western academics tried to lump the incredibly diverse, complex musical traditions of an entire continent into one primitive, monolithic idea of African rhythm. Postcolonial musicology stepped in and demanded that African music be treated as the diverse, sophisticated body of work that it actually is.
And finally, Part 6, Application in Theater and Philosophy. Let's look at how both the physical stage and the realm of pure thought became battlegrounds for identity.
Helen Gilbert notes something absolutely fascinating about the dramatic arts. Originally, in settler colonies, places like Australia, New Zealand, or the Caribbean, theater spaces were literally built just to entertain the colonial masters. They were symbols of colonial culture. But in the post-colonial era, those exact same physical stages were reclaimed by the colonized. They flipped the script and transformed the theater into this incredibly dynamic tool for cultural resistance and biting political critique.
We see this so vividly in practice. In Kenyan theater, the play I Will Marry When I Want by Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ngugi wa Miri was an incredibly powerful performative critique of neocolonialism. It was art as activism. And then, jumping over to philosophy, Kwame Anthony Appiah does something very similar in his work In My Father's House. He totally deconstructs the arrogant assumption that rigorous logical reasoning is somehow the exclusive property of Western thinkers like Plato or Aristotle. Appiah pushes back against the idea of a single, monolithic African identity, proving that African philosophy is extraordinarily rich, nuanced, and entirely shaped by those dynamic hybrid identities we explored earlier.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought. Postcolonial theory isn't just some dusty, abstract history lesson. It is a living, breathing lens. It absolutely demands that you question the foundations of the knowledge you interact with every single day. So ask yourself, how does the legacy of the colonial gaze still shape the textbooks you read, the art you look at, and the media you consume right now? Keep that question in the back of your mind as you continue your journey through the humanities. It's a real game changer.